Good evening, everybody. We're going to get started. Welcome to a conversation about inclusionary zoning, lessons learned for building mixed-income communities, and the lessons learned are coming live from New York and Boston for the evening. My name is Nicole Swerhun. I'm here as your moderator. Before I turn it over to the Deputy Mayor to give some welcoming remarks, I just wanted to acknowledge that the land we're meeting on is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. To get us started for the evening, I'm very happy to introduce Deputy Mayor Anna Bailão. She's also councillor for Ward 9, Davenport. She's on the Mayor's Executive Committee, the chair of the Planning and Housing Committee, and also the city's housing advocate. And I'm going to turn things right over to her. Anna.
Thank you, Nicole. Good evening, everyone. I want to start by thanking all of you for joining us here today. It's great to see all the interest in inclusionary zoning and housing in general. And I want to welcome and welcome to our city and welcome to this discussion our guests, Louise, Carroll, and Tim Davis. Thank you for joining us here today, and I'm really looking forward to hear from you, to learn from you, and to have a discussion with all the guests here. As you see from the 120 cranes around the city, Toronto is really growing, and it's growing fast. I was actually doing a speech this afternoon about housing, and in my speech I talked about the 120 cranes and went to do some research and see what other cities have this kind of number. Well, not even close. Los Angeles and Seattle are the next two with 49 each. So we are really growing at a fast pace. And as our city grows, we want to make sure that new housing is affordable for those who call Toronto home or those who would like to call Toronto home. Housing has become one of the most pressing issues facing our city, and residents are facing challenges across the housing spectrum. Specific groups, such as those experiencing chronic homelessness, Indigenous peoples, seniors, single-led households, and newcomers, are facing particularly acute challenges. In recent years, housing affordability has impacted not only the city's most vulnerable residents, but increasingly low and moderate income households as well. Couples looking to grow their families, seniors, and young professionals. Toronto renters, especially those looking for housing in today's market, have been mostly impacted by increasing housing affordability issues. Actually, through the research that we've done for our new Toronto housing plan that we'll be launching in about a month, we know that there's about 112,000 renters in our city that spend more than 50% of their income to pay their rent every month. The rental market is becoming more expensive, and at the same time, moderate income households are being priced out of the ownership market. All Torontonians should have safe, secure, affordable, and well-maintained homes where they can realize their full potential, because only that way will the city realize its full potential. The city is currently developing a new housing plan to address the full spectrum of housing issues in Toronto, from homelessness and shelter use to social and transitional housing to affordable and market ownership and rental housing. Inclusionary zoning was raised frequently in the housing plan consultations, and the city sees inclusionary zoning as an important tool in the housing toolbox to help address our housing needs. I remind everybody that we've been asking for this tool for a long time. To be precise, Council has asked the provincial government 14 times, and it wouldn't be right not to acknowledge the presence of former Minister of Municipal Affairs, Peter Milchin, and thank him for bringing it forward and the previous government. And we really hope that we can continue to implement it and see this through. So thank you for joining us here today and for your work as Minister and bringing inclusionary zoning. Inclusionary zoning will allow us to require that new developments provide a portion of the new units as affordable rents and prices. It's a tool that leverages areas of the city where there has been investment and the market is strong in order to ensure our growth is inclusive and increases the supply of affordable housing. Toronto is the first Ontario municipality to advance policies of inclusionary zoning. And as we do so, we want to look to the experiences and lessons learned from other cities. We are fortunate to have Tim and to have Louise here with us tonight to share their advice with us and to tell us about Boston and New York's inclusionary zoning frameworks. We will be listening closely and to the discussion and keeping your advice in mind as we advance inclusionary zoning in Toronto. Thank you again, Tim and Louise. I will now turn it back to Nicole to proceed with the evening, and I'm looking forward to hearing the presentations and all the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor, Deputy Mayor. So just a quick orientation of how we are planning on using the time together tonight. We're going to be here till 8:30. We've got 3 speakers sort of setting the stage. Our chief planner, Gregg Lintern, will start us off, and Tim Davis from the city of Boston will follow, and then Louise Carroll from New York. And we think that's going to take about an hour. And then we're going to move on to some questions for Tim and Louise. And if you want a little more detail on their bios, when you came in, you would have picked up a little program. It looks like this. And if you want the opportunity to sort of raise a question with them, you would have also picked up a little card like this. And if you need one, you can always put your hand up, and one of the folks from the city's team will deliver one in. There will be a couple of opportunities through the evening where the city team will be collecting these cards, and we will be feeding them to Tim and Louise as the night unfolds. There will be one chance where they'll collect the cards after Tim's remarks and another chance after Louise's remarks, so it should be pretty straightforward. The other couple of housekeeping things, you'll see there's a camera recording the evening tonight. Thank you very much, Terry. The recording will be on the city's website, and the presentations you'll see will also be available on the city's website. So everything will be available after and open for sharing should you see fit. I think that's enough for me. I want to introduce Gregg Lintern. I don't think he needs a lot of introduction. Many of you are very familiar with Gregg and the work that he does. He certainly made a commitment to making Toronto one of the most equitable and most livable cities on the planet. It's an ambitious goal. I read it in your bio, but I know it's also true from, I also know it's true from your work. And we've had the great pleasure, our firm and me personally, in working with Gregg regularly over the last long period of time. And so without any further ado, we'll hand it over to Gregg to get us started.
Thank you, Nicole. I am going to just focus on this planet. Moving on to Mars is not on my agenda. So also, I just wanted to welcome Tim and Louise tonight. We had a few minutes this afternoon, a couple hours, in a quick discussion, getting some really valuable insights. And I think from just those few minutes with them, I think you're really going to enjoy hearing their perspective, the challenges that they're up against in Boston and New York City. Very applicable, so many similarities. Great insights about how we can approach inclusionary zoning in Toronto, and I really think you're going to enjoy this evening. The speakers, Deputy Mayor Gregg, there we go. So, if you and maybe your loved ones have looked for housing in Toronto recently, you'll know that. It's a big issue around the affordability and the picture of housing need in Toronto. It's been changing quite a bit recently, and how much even renter households are disproportionately impacted by the affordability issue that maybe all of us are experiencing. Half of the city's households are renters. That's traditionally been a big number in Toronto. It's actually, that proportion is growing. 1 in 4 spend more than half of their income on rent, and 1 in 5 live in unsuitable housing. In other words, it may not be suitable for their family condition. Maybe it's not enough bedrooms, for example, for their needs. If you look at these numbers across the city, then about 1 in 4 Toronto households are struggling with housing affordability. The trends, and we've reported on this, and there's lots of good stuff on our Inclusionary Zoning website on this. We approve a lot of housing in Toronto. That is no question that we do that. We're running around 21,000 units a year approved over the last 5 years. We have a very healthy market producing housing, bringing it online, and that's witnessed by the cranes that the Deputy Mayor mentioned. But the demand for rental housing continues to outpace the supply, and that's a significant subject and target for inclusionary zoning. And these vacancy rates tell you about how tight it is. Despite all that supply that's being added, where the city has even seen the most growth, like downtown and the centers, Yonge and Eglinton, North York Centre, these are always also the areas where residents are struggling most with affordability. These areas have the highest number of renter households paying more than 50% of their rent. So there's a real correlation there. And of the thousands of units being built or approved over the last 5 years, only about 2% have been affordable, meeting our official plan definition of affordable. Almost all of them were created because there was a supportive government program behind it, making it work. We show this graphic a lot. It kind of gives you a sense of the housing spectrum, all the different situations that one might find themselves in relationship to housing in Toronto, the way that different residents experience housing differently across that spectrum, all the way from homelessness to social and transitional housing to affordable, and of course market housing. And as the Deputy Mayor noted, the city is working on its next longer-term housing plan, 2020-2030, which is going to be dealing very broadly in many, many different ways across the spectrum. In city planning, a lot of work that we do in city planning is in the policy and regulatory space. Tends to be at the market end of the spectrum. We certainly are active across the spectrum, especially when it comes to, and we've recently, for example, dealt with shelter zoning permission to make it more permissive. But certainly our focus is on how we might shape and influence the market. Two big baskets there are about maintaining what we have. We have a lot of rental housing in Toronto, and a lot of the focus of policy is about keeping what we've got. For example, we have demolition and replacement policies and deal with those who want to redevelop rental housing and require their replacement. We also deal with the mix of housing, trying to respond more closely to people's needs and all the different types of situations, household situations, such as family-size units in various growth areas of the city. We have also more recently put in place zoning, as-of-right zoning permission for second suites with no parking, I always like to say, and laneway suites with no parking. So little things that we can do that begin to add up to changing the track that we're on. Advancing policies to support the creation of new affordable housing. We've done that traditionally through large sites policies in Section 37. Of course, it's never been enough. We've also leveraged more recently in the last 5 to 6 years, and then even more recently in the last year, leveraged our own resources through Open Door, for example, which is direct Toronto subsidy to produce since 2016 over 6,000 affordable rental units that have been approved through that program. And then more recently through the Mayor's Housing Now initiative, actually bringing city sites, surplus city sites onto the market to produce upwards of 3,700 rental units. So what is IZ, IH? There's so many different ways and depending on what country you're in. Over the course of tonight, you're likely going to hear all of those, maybe more. But essentially, it's something that allows municipalities to require affordable housing in new development. It's a tool that leverages growth in the housing market, and I talked about the 21,000 odd units that we approve every year, to leverage that growth and create more affordable housing in an inclusionary manner. It would be mandatory in certain developments, meaning that affordable rental or affordable ownership units would be secured as part of that development approval process. It's different than 37, something that people are traditionally used to, in that the requirements are set out up front, and instead of being negotiated on a site-by-site basis. And again, they would be mandatory. Here in Ontario, all of this is governed by the Planning Act, sets out the rules of the game, so to speak, and those provincial regulations guide the choices that municipalities can make when it comes to how we want to approach implementing inclusionary zoning. It's a land use planning tool. Essentially, many of you here tonight have known that we've been asking for a long, long time for this legislation, and we've had it, the implementation opportunity since only April 2018, as was noted by Deputy Mayor Bailão and the attendance tonight with the former Minister of Housing. The inclusionary zoning is new to Ontario, but is something that is much more common in other jurisdictions and certainly across the United States. Who does it help? It tends to be focused in that area of low to moderate income households, those who earn too much to be eligible for social housing, but not enough to afford purely a market rent or a sale price. If you lined up all households in Toronto from the lowest income earners to the highest, this would tend to help to address the needs of those in the middle third of the housing income spectrum. Key workers, and we use these analogies a lot for people to understand who we're talking about here, but a range of income from 39 to 82,000 Canadian per year, including such things as administrative assistants, tradespeople, visual artists, retail managers. You can imagine the types of people that you may know that earn these levels of incomes, and how this could be directed at helping those people. It's one tool, one policy tool. It doesn't address the deepest housing needs. However, there is the opportunity to layer in some of our other program approaches so that you could couple an inclusionary zoning approach with perhaps some other subsidy package like Open Door, and get at some deeper subsidy and a deeper penetration into the housing spectrum. And it's, again, important to note that this is one tool that we feel will have a real impact on affordable housing opportunity. The work that we've done to date, after many years, of course, of asking the province, we've completed our initial background work earlier in the year, including a housing need and demand analysis and a financial impact analysis. Those documents are online. We're looking at how those requirements essentially would affect different land values across the city. We talk about Toronto, but we all know this is just not one place. It's many places with many different dynamics, and certainly many different market dynamics that have to be taken into account. The preliminary findings, as well as all of the initial meetings that we've had with stakeholders, help shape an initial approach that we've tabled with Planning and Housing Committee back in May. Since then, we've been consulting more broadly on those directions. We have heard recently through adoption of different provincial legislation, Bill 108 and the growth plan, that the use of inclusionary zoning will be limited to protected major transit station areas, geographies around transit stations, or areas where a development permit system has been ordered by the minister. This is a little less permissive than the city had originally hoped for, and we're going to continue likely to advocate for the broadest possible use of inclusionary zoning. That implementation framework around those transit stations, if we're going to use IZ, has to be detailed it has to be put forward in a very detailed manner, and it has to be sent up to the Minister of Housing. Despite these changes, of course, we're very committed to advancing the inclusionary zoning policies. There are some other aspects of the legislation that are being changed, and we're in a bit of a hold as we wait for the province to introduce those regulations. Nevertheless, we're advancing our work, and that's part of tonight, certainly. So finally, our goals overall to increase the supply, that's, I think, obvious, the situation that we're in. I think the second point is really crucial, that we want to encourage market housing development, or continue to encourage market housing development, because that is the tool that we're going to use to lever the affordable housing that would come with inclusionary zoning. We'll know that the policy is being successful if we're able to make that connection. Finally, we in planning, and certainly the way that we approach livability in Toronto, is to build complete communities. So in the rush and the desperate need to build affordable housing, we cannot forget that we're building complete communities, and we have to think about that and the equity and the needs of individual communities across the city. So we're hoping tonight to hear some really great stuff from Boston and New York. As I said earlier, it's fascinating to hear the comparators, the differences, the challenges. Our next steps are going to be about producing our consultation summary to Planning and Housing Committee next week, and updating likely some of the background work that we've done over the course of the last year, especially reflecting the directions that are going to be forthcoming in the regulations that are coming out from the province. And as was noted, we're the first municipality in Ontario likely to get our policy directions forward, or likely will be among the first to get it to the Ministry of Municipal Affairs. So we're actually very, very fortunate to be having this conversation tonight with you and our visitors from the United States. So with that, I will turn it back over to Nicole.
Great, thank you. So one of the messages that emerged from the consultation the city has been doing most recently over the last several months on inclusionary zoning certainly was learning from other jurisdictions. And so that's not only something that the city itself was interested in, it's straight from the meeting notes, from the conversations that were held with stakeholders and the public. And so first on our list tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce Tim Davis from Boston. He's been in housing for over 25 years, and he's the housing policy manager at the Boston Planning and Development Agency. I also know that about 20 years ago, he ran into some Torontonians that he thought were nice, and he comes every year or so for the last 20 years. And he's watched the explosive growth that our city has and is continuing to experience. So we'll hand it over to Tim to share his thoughts from Boston's perspective. Thank you.
So I'm just going to begin with the very context. I'm going to move through this first part pretty quickly because I know you want to get to the meat of the conversation. Boston is a city of 48 square miles, or 124 square kilometers. That's about 20% of the size of Toronto. It's a city of walkable neighborhoods with a population of 700,000. It has over 800,000 people working in the city each day, and 15,000 new jobs are being created each year. It is the core of a metropolitan area of 4.9 million people and a greater metropolitan region of 8.3 million people. So the dark green is our core metro. The lighter green is the rest. It's very large. It encompasses all of eastern Massachusetts, all of Rhode Island, 78% of the population of New Hampshire. So even though Boston is small in some ways, it's like the Golden Horseshoe in others. Boston's recently seen population growth of 9,000 to 10,000 people per year. This is the fastest growth since the 19-teens. Why I have the picture here? This is our iconic triple-decker. This was our answer to growth in the 19-teens, was these tightly compact multi-family houses, usually 3 units each, with an owner-occupant in 1 unit, and maybe extended family in the other 2 units. These are still important to us as new immigrant housing for extended families, but also we're the biggest college town in America. Some of these in some neighborhoods are also entirely occupied by loads of students. Housing costs are escalating. From 2010 to 2017, Condo sales prices have increased 5.5% per year, and rents have increased 3.2% per year. This graph here is for the sales prices for Greater Boston, and in the city of Boston, it's grown even faster. You can see the Great Recession, how that there was a decline there, and the increases since that time. Comparable to Toronto, 49% of renters are spend more than 30% of their income to rent. While regional housing production lags behind Boston, over the last 7 years, 62% of the units permitted from 2011 to 2018 are in the 21 municipalities in the inner core are in Boston. This map here is of multifamily permitting. You can see some of our inner suburbs are not permitting multifamily housing, which is creating desperate problems for us as a whole. Under Mayor Marty Walsh, my boss, we created in 2000, he came into office in early 2014, we created the first Housing Boston 2030 plan with a goal of creating 53,000 new units, of which 12,000 would be income restricted or below market or affordable. There's different terms for it. We found that with the growth of the city during this period, we really had to update it. So last year we updated that to 69,000 new units with almost 16,000 income restricted, while also making sure that our 54,000 existing income restricted units were preserved by specifically preserving 30,000 of those. The others are all in good shape, and renovating and rebuilding 4,500 units of public housing. The City of Boston supports the preservation and creation of income-restricted affordable housing through a number of programs and agencies. The Inclusionary Development Policy, which I'll call IDP, is also one of those. Inclusionary Development Policy units, as has been mentioned already, are created by private developers without any public subsidy. Depending upon income, households access different programs in our city. So public rental housing and rental vouchers serve the lowest income households. Subsidized rental production, which is the capital funds from the city, the state, federal sources for new affordable housing, provides support for those units. And then the IDP rental units, the next layer up, and the condo units towards the top. And those on the incomes on the right are for a single person or family of 3. Afraid it's in US dollars though. The IDP was first created in 2000 through an executive order of Mayor Thomas Menino and is actually not part of zoning, which is unusual for most inclusionary development policies in the US. Massachusetts has given 350 of 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts the right to do it in zoning, but they have a separate law for zoning for the city of Boston than they do for the other cities and towns. And so we are now asking for that right to do that, but the reason why it has worked so well in Boston is because we have a zoning code that is desperately in need of updating. We're working to try to update it, and so 95% of projects are not as of right. So if they need a zoning variance, we get the inclusionary development policy is activated where there's a zoning variance. Current activities, we're currently reviewing the policy. This is a good time to get me because I'm thinking a lot about this. We too have a financial feasibility study. We too have a community process. And we have a technical advisor committee of advocates and developers working to look at see what we're doing. Our IDP applies to any proposed residential project that has 10 or more units, requires zoning relief, is financed by the city, or is built on property owned by the city. And property owned by the city, we're usually doing considerably more affordability that requires subsidies as well. The IDP creates income-restricted housing with private funding. Developers can meet their IDP commitment through 3 methods. On-site, currently 13% of the units scattered throughout the project. Off-site, which is 15 to 18% of the units in a nearby location. That percentage difference is depending on which neighborhood they're located in. Or they can pay into the IDP fund, which is a contribution based on 15 to 18% of the units. My agency is the city's planning and development review agency. We are a quasi-public agency. We're not part of the city government directly. And so the funds are given over to a city department that funds traditional affordable housing. As part of this process, we created 3 zones to make sure that we can secure more resources from downtown developments, just like Toronto. We have downtown neighborhoods that are booming and they're doing luxury condos, and we have mid-market neighborhoods where there's a strong market and there's a lot of building, but more mid-level 5, 6-story buildings. And then we have in outer neighborhoods where there's not much going on at all, except maybe next to immediately to transit. Over 2001 to 2018, we've completed 2,600 on-site and off-site units. You can see the map of where those units are located. Of those, 7% are off-site units, or 181. 25% are ownership units, and 75% are rental units, which means that we're also building only about 25% of our new housing is ownership housing, and 75% is rental. Now, unlike most American cities, and actually unlike Toronto as well, 2/3 of Boston households are renters, so it's a higher percentage. New York's is also high too, yes. IDP on-site units provide units that the market is not creating. So during 2018, only 1% of advertised rents in Boston were less than 70% of AMI rents. Now, AMI is a term that we use a lot in the US. It means area median income. It's established by HUD for our region, not just our city. And we base all our programs on that. So, for example, if you're in a traditional affordable housing project, there may be units that are set aside for people at, quote unquote, 30% of area median income or 50% of area median income. And so, because we're serving a slightly higher income bracket than those programs, we set our rental rates at 70% of AMI, which is $1,300 for a 1-bedroom apartment and $1,500 for a 2-bedroom apartment. And I had a little note on that as well. I had to say, actually backing up one, I had one thing. Yeah, thank you. I want to back up to this. Before the inclusionary development policy, 35% of production was in downtown neighborhoods of all production, but only 21% of affordable housing production was. So we were concentrating our affordable housing production in the neighborhoods. Over the last 3 years, affordable production is equal in both the downtown neighborhoods and in the outer neighborhoods. So that's an important part about equity and trying to create equitable neighborhoods. So the note I was going to say about this is median rent for a 1-bedroom in a newer building in an outer neighborhood in Boston is about $2,000 and $3,300 in the downtown neighborhoods. These are all US dollars. And for 2 bedrooms, it's about $2,600 in an outer neighborhood and about $4,800 a month downtown. For condos, our median sales prices are now over $600,000 a unit. So that's an important context for that. So only 1% of our advertised rents in Boston were less than what we charge in our units, and only 3% of condominium sales. So there's no units out there that are equal to those. Other outcomes, contributions to the IDP fund, $137 million received through 2018. $13.5 million of that was received just in 2018. That has supported the completion of an additional 1414 income restricted units, and most of those are more deeply affordable and are spread across the city. This map, the red dots are where those units are located. The yellow dots are where projects have actually paid into the fund. The IDP is also responding to changing needs. We have an acquisition opportunity program. This is where we are working with both nonprofit and private owners to purchase existing rental housing that's not income restricted and income restricted. This is mostly to protect tenants who might otherwise be displaced in a very increasing market with increasing rents. Off-site commitments are also used to renovate and extend the affordability protections for 97 units. We have a series of income-restricted buildings that were created 40 years ago under a state program where their income restrictions are expiring and they're located in downtown neighborhoods, and the owner of the building would sell it out into the market otherwise. So we made an arrangement with a nonprofit to buy this and used off-site units to actually renovate and restore their income restrictions. Also, off-site commitments are being used to build 2 senior projects in the South Boston neighborhood. So this is the real meat of it. So talking about process, one important distinct thing to think about is who has the authority to establish requirements? What is the role of the mayor? What is the role of the city council? Currently, as an executive order, it is the mayor who sets the policy in Boston. In some cities, it is the city council. And that obviously creates the possibility for it becoming a political football. And even in Boston, where the mayor sets it, we had a city council election yesterday where there were a number of candidates who had specifically in their platforms what they want to see the IDP be. So that's the thing to consider. The financial feasibility analysis. Make sure it has good market data, rent, sales prices. Check to see if there are distinct markets, and you've obviously defined that there are some here. And to look at the development costs. What we're seeing in Boston is that construction costs are escalating tremendously. That's undermining the ability for the projects that are even already approved to move forward. Who do you engage in the process? Developers, yes, include the developers, advocates, politicians, and the community as a whole. So what we've done as part of our current update process is we've had a technical advisory committee of developers and nonprofits, but we've also gone out to community meetings. We held meetings in the neighborhoods. Our planning staff helped us to do meetings. We have some planning processes in different neighborhoods where we kind of piggybacked on them to have specific meetings to actually explain what this program is and to get feedback on it. Some of the inclusionary requirements to be mindful of are the size trigger. Now, I've heard that Toronto is looking at some pretty large unit sizes, and that may be a really good answer for Toronto, especially right now. You're introducing a new program. One of the reasons why Boston's program has been successful, it was introduced at a fairly low level in terms of the percent of units. The AMI, the income targeting was fairly high, and over time we've been able to increase the requirements, and the development community has become to be more familiar with it. I recall a time in the mid-90s where I got an occasion to meet with a developer who was going to be building an apartment building in my neighborhood as I was working for a nonprofit, and we said, would you consider doing some income-restricted housing in your building for the neighborhood? He's like, not our business model. You know, that was it, go away. 3 years later, we have a policy. It's now everybody's business model that they do this. Small developers to big developers. Now, our current policy is 10 units. You think that's really small. Guess what? We have 9-unit buildings cropping up all over the city because there's developers who just don't want to come in and talk to me. So now we're thinking about addressing that. We have basically a consensus that we want to move this to 5 units. Of course, the challenge is how do you implement that on smaller projects? We already have challenges when we, our compliance staff, are chasing this little developer, this little landowner, about his 2 units for 50 years, and whether or not he's renting them to the appropriate people, whether he's, keeping the units up, et cetera. So probably what we're going to do is on the very smallest projects, have those projects cash out. What is it? Is it percent of units or percent of square footage? We have set up our program as percent of units. Now, we also have requirements around that the units are comparable in size and type to the other units in the building. But even then, there are some ways in which it can be approved, and a lot of cities have moved to a percent of square footage. It's percent of units is simpler, more transparent to the public. They say, oh, it's 10% of the units. They can count that. They know what it is. They know what you're doing. But if you're doing square footage, you might have a different unit count. But at least that gives us the ability to deal with both buildings with lots of small units, and you want some family units, or buildings with really big units, and instead of having one 3,000 square foot unit, why don't we get 3 1,000 square foot units? Do you base it on all the units in the project or on a density bonus? We base it on all the units. There's no one correct answer here. It depends on your direction. I think that it seems like you're going on a density bonus. I think that might be really smart in terms of thinking about how to implement the program and make it distinct from what you're doing with the rest of your work. What is the income range you're serving? What are the gaps in the current housing system? What are the needs? I think you've had the studies that tell you a lot about that. Are there preferences that can help serve specific needs? We're looking at doing a preference that is specifically for households that are what we call rent burned, meaning they're paying more than 30% of their income to rent, or in fact 50% of their income to rent. Do you look at zones? Does the city have more than one market? There's ways to vary the program by zone. Do you have different on-site requirements by zone? Do you have different off-site requirements or buyouts by zone? Traditionally, we've had the same on-site requirements city-wide. We've had different off-site requirements. We're actually probably in the next iteration going to have different on-site requirements as well, because we realize that we can probably get 15 or 16% of the units in a downtown building, but still only 13% in the neighborhoods. Also, the question of whether you should serve different incomes in different neighborhoods. It's something we struggle with. We get a lot of comments from people in the neighborhood saying, Well, our neighborhood is already a fairly low-income neighborhood, so you should do units in our neighborhood that fit that income bracket. Or downtown neighborhoods where they say, oh, families that are making $100,000 are being pushed out. We should have units for people making $100,000. The problem with that for me, is that's a fair housing problem. We want to provide units at all income levels across the city. And so that's one reason why we're going to be moving to probably, instead of having one income limit, to having an average, where we have bands of incomes, but it'll be across the city. So someone making $40,000 living in an outer neighborhood has the opportunity to move into a downtown neighborhood if they're making $40,000. The time and length of the income restriction, I know there's been discussions here about doing 25 years. Our current is 50 years. Our goal is to move it to 99 years or perpetuity. The only thing holding us back is that we have to work through some state regulatory issues to get to there. And one of the things that's been asked is to developers, their timeline, it doesn't really go beyond 25 years. So going from 50 to 99 really doesn't make a lot of difference to developers, but it does make difference to our neighborhoods. Pricing of units, this is getting into the implementation weeds consideration. What are you looking at percent of income? Are you creating a marketing window? And most importantly, how are you setting the system up so that as time changes, that the rents or the sales prices don't increase too much, so that the unit eventually becomes no longer affordable? Marketing. So as an organically grown program that started in a time when we did not have big data and lots of whiz-bang apps and everything else to help us get through the system, every building was its own project. Every building had its own lottery. Every building has its own wait list. It is a nightmare for the consumer to manage that system. We've made some improvements to how we do things. We're looking to other cities, including to New York, to see how we can do something more in terms of one-stop application portals. But we also have the situation where many of our lotteries, although they're managed by our Fair Housing Office, they're run by these third-party marketing agencies. These are for-profit companies. And in fact, that costs a lot of money to the developer, and it doesn't necessarily get the best outcome. So that's one thing that we're really struggling with, is how we can move our system to something that works better. Whereas right now, we get no funds from the developers to monitor these units or market these units. They pay to market them. There's a lot of inefficiencies in that system that I think we can work on. And those are things that I think if you can do it better from the start, that would be good. Now, the city of Cambridge, our neighbor next door, has a very healthy inclusionary zoning system as well. And they have moved to a single wait list for all of their units. So the developer doesn't even pick who moves into their building. They just say, oh, I've got a new unit. And they say, here they are. Here's your person. So it's much more, I mean, it's obviously it's a city of 100,000 people, not 700,000 people or 3 million. But I have heard from them that it is actually pretty exhausting on the staffing side to keep that up. The implementation items that are managed by our agency is we approve the tenants and buyers, both at initial rent or sale and also on resale. And of course, the ongoing compliance. And I don't need to tell you stories. You can probably imagine the stories all day long about the property owner who isn't doing what they're doing, or the people who are trying to get in units that shouldn't be getting in units. I mean, it's endless, but it's the work that any housing agency has to do to make sure that the program is used appropriately. And again, program cost. We use our own operating funds to pay for this implementation. The question for you is, how do you want to pay for it? Is this something that you ask the developers to pay a small fee for, but you take a lot of the work off their hands and make it a more efficient system? And that is all I have.
Thank you very much, Tim. Next up, we have Louise Carroll. She's Commissioner of Housing Preservation and Development in New York City. And this is her first time in Toronto, and her observation is that we have a lot of land compared to what she has to work with. She was instrumental in both the design and implementation of New York's path-breaking mandatory inclusionary housing program to require creation of permanently affordable housing as part of residential rezonings, and streamlined and revamped the agency's approach to the voluntary inclusionary housing program to produce record number of affordable homes. So we're super keen to hear from New York as well. Louise, over to you.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for inviting me over. I am not going to work through slides. I'm just going to talk to you. You can find my slides at, yes. So if you go to the website for your planning division, you'll be able to find the presentation. So it's my first time in Toronto, and when I was told that you're in the planning process for an inclusionary zoning program, I was really excited, and I decided that I really had to come. But then looking through the window of the plane as I was coming into your city, I saw, as was said before, all this land, and I got really, really, really excited for you. I could use some of it. So, how do we get here? In New York City, our experience with inclusionary zoning or inclusionary housing is longer than yours. We started in 1987. But I suspect everybody who comes to this program, we come with the same story, which is, a growing population and a lack of housing for the workforce and the population in the city. And so for us today in New York City, we have about 8.6 million people. By 2040, we're projected to be over 9 million. From about 2009 to 2018, we provided in the city over 700,000 jobs, but only about 97,000 homes. That crisis is now causing people to fear new jobs coming into the city because people don't know where, people fear displacement, and they're not sure where all these people are going to live. With the increase in population and the lack of housing, our rents have also increased. So the average rents for all New Yorkers increased by 6.2% from about 2014 to 2017. With this diminishing housing, the increase in the population, in fact, our population is increasing from births, not because basically our people are living longer and more people are being born than people are moving or dying. And so we as a city have to grapple with this. And so while housing is being produced, our challenge is making sure that that housing is produced so that there's economic diversity within our city. Cities that don't have economic diversity do not thrive. We need housing for everyone. We need housing for the social worker, for the nanny, for the banker, for the lawyer, for the artist, right? This is what makes a city vibrant. And so when Mayor de Blasio campaigned and took office, he pledged that he would create about 200,000 units of affordable housing by 2024. We have since increased that target to 300,000 units of affordable housing by 2026. To date, we've produced about 135,000 of preserved or created 135,000 affordable homes since 2014. Part of what the mayor wanted to do was create a varied approach to creating this housing. Yes, we're going to spend and create housing for seniors. We're going to spend and create housing for the homeless. We're going to create new opportunities for people to purchase homes, affordable homes, through our open door affordable housing program, which is a homeownership program, not a rental program, as you have here. And to provide supportive housing for people who have real challenges and need supportive services on site so that they can realize their full potential. But we can't spend our way as a city out of the housing crisis. We need the private market to provide housing for a range of incomes to help create this economic diversity. And this is why we turned first to a voluntary inclusionary housing program in 1987. And, you know, we believe that all inclusionary housing is voluntary. However, our voluntary inclusionary housing program basically rezoned high-value areas and basically offered developers a density bonus if they would include permanently affordable inclusionary housing units. A lot of the debate in our city was that by making it voluntary, we didn't get the full potential of our rezonings. And so the push for us was to create a mandatory inclusionary housing program that would be just one of a range of tools to get to that 300,000 units by 2026. So what do? We embarked on a feasibility study in 2014. We hired a financial analyst to work with us and the team. And by 2026, through a long community engagement process with our legislature as well as our city planning commission, we passed the city's mandatory inclusionary housing program. And that program, we hope for the future, will leverage the private market, save the city subsidies for other affordable housing programs, and create permanently affordable housing. Housing that is a land trust for the community. So when we finance housing, we typically finance housing for 30 years or for 60 years, and that housing comes back to us for refinancing, or we're trying to find tools to make sure that people don't, we don't lose that housing to the private market over time. With our mandatory inclusionary housing program, we know that when we create those units, we don't have that worry. We're not refinancing the same units over and over again, but that we're increasing the housing stock so that these units remain permanently affordable as a land trust for our community. So our voluntary housing program from about 2009 has produced about 10,300 units, so about 1,000 units a year that is mostly privately financed, mostly in mixed income projects. We have a few off-site, and we rely on those market rents to basically pay for the upkeep of those programs. For our mandatory inclusionary housing, the way it works is that we study areas, and for us this is very difficult because New York City is very dense and we don't have a lot of property. So we're looking for areas where there's growth potential. We're looking for areas where there are soft sites that can be developed, and we're upzoning those areas. So we're giving developers a zoning bonus, and in exchange we're saying the housing that you produce has to have a range of affordability permanently. In addition, we invite private applications. So to the extent the city hasn't studied an area for rezoning, and we've done about 5 area-wide rezonings so far, a developer can assemble sites and come to our city planning commission and request an upzoning to that on which we would impose mandatory inclusionary housing. Also, for areas for manufacturing districts that are no longer viable, people with land in those areas can also put in a private application to change the use of the zoning from manufacturing to residential, and in that case we would also impose mandatory inclusionary housing. So the program that we came up with was a basic 2-option program. So the City Planning Commission will study an area and decide based on many factors, the economic factors in the area, the housing in the area, whether it can support a 25% affordability requirement or a 30% affordability requirement. So basically we're requiring 25% of the floor area of any new residential property to be permanently affordable housing at an average of 60% AMI. And the averaging is important because we're, project by project, and depending on the financing tools or other subsidies, people are able to be creative about who's served in that housing. The second basic option is a 30% option. 30% of the residential floor area in a property has to be affordable at an average of 80% AMI. As you can see, the bigger chunk of the residential housing that we're requiring to be affordable, the higher the average AMI is. So we're really toggling deeper affordability and a lesser requirement versus more affordability and an ability to serve higher incomes. The City Council, we asked the City Council for a third option, a workforce option, which they really tortured. So we do have a workforce option, but it's not the one we wanted. And so that is an optional option. So of the two basic options, either one must be mapped. And the council has the opportunity to add an optional option to the area so that developers can choose which they would like to do. And so there's a very deep affordability option, which is 20% at the 40% AMI level, and the workforce option, which is 30% at an average of 115% AMI. So what we found in our voluntary program, which works very well, is that we need to really be clear about what we're requiring from developers. It needs to be written. It needs to be something that anybody can see and understand and plan their development. Any ambiguity hurts the market. It hurts your ability to get housing quickly online. And some of the things we're grappling with is, where should these units be in a building? The tendency might be to lump them all on the bottom floors or put them all in the most undesirable part of the building. Or if should we have an on-site or off-site option? And so we carried over from our voluntary program distribution requirements, basically saying you have to distribute these affordable units on 65% of the floors of your building. That where we're making sure that affordable units are not clustered together and that it's not easy to know who's living on what floor. We also had to ask ourselves what type of units we wanted to produce. So yes, we wanted the market to produce the units that fit that market. So we said, okay, our affordable units have to be a proportional size to the market rate units for the bedroom type. But at the end of the day, we want to see at least 50% two bedrooms so that we have family size units and no more than 25% studios. In addition, we said, look, in terms of sizes of the units, we didn't want our units to be too small or too big. And so we said we want our units to be the average size of all of the market rate units. But to the extent that you have really large market rate units, we didn't want to get just a few affordable units that are 3,000 square feet. And so we have default unit sizes so that if the market rate units that are being produced are really big units, our focus is getting reasonably sized units. So we have a default. And the other thing we had to ask ourselves is what type of building should this apply to? And for us, compliance and enforcement is of the utmost importance. You cannot say you have permanently affordable units if you don't know where they are, if you don't know who's in them, and you don't know what the rents are. So we argued with the council that it should apply to properties of 50 units or more. We lost that fight. So our program applies to developments, enlargements, conversions that have more than 10 units or are above 2,500 square feet. We have a payment in lieu option. The architects, me and my colleagues really felt that that was necessary, that there are instances of hardship where people need to be able to pay out. And there's also people that you just don't want to be in charge of affordable housing. and so we felt that there had to be an opportunity for these people to pay to the city. The politics didn't really work out in our favor, and so our in lieu fee is very, very high, which means it's really not affordable. And so, we think what that's going to do is either people just won't develop who can't make it work, or, we're going to really have to watch the people who do make it work when we think that it really isn't feasible. In our ordinance, we're aware that you may have odd sites, you may have weird site situations on your property that may make the ordinance infeasible. And for that, we allow people to appeal to our Board of Standards and Appeals. And the basic standard for their ability to appeal is that it is the ordinance that makes their project infeasible, not something else. That we feel that's a high standard, and nobody has challenged it, and nobody has been able to get a waiver through it. We grappled with on-site, off-site. We have the ability to do inclusionary housing off-site as part of our voluntary program. And that has worked well. Most people do on-site because land in New York City is so expensive. It's unlikely that you have two sites that you want to put under this program. But there are, and for us, off-site doesn't mean a separate building on the same zoning lot. Off-site means on a separate zoning lot within the community board and within a half mile of the actual market rate units. And we grappled with that, and we really came down with feeling that there are instances where it would make sense, but then we'd require more housing in order to let someone go off-site. And so we included a 5% additional requirement for properties that wanted to build the housing off-site. We have a robust compliance program. We have, in New York City, we have something called Housing Connect. All of our housing is marketed through Housing Connect. So anybody in New York City can go in, create a profile, get a sort of ping when there's housing being advertised. All of our units must be advertised on that website. We have a marketing department that basically we required that our developers hire not-for-profit administering agents to be in charge of the marketing. These not-for-profit administering agents are under contract with us. They have an agreement with us. If they don't do the right thing, we can fire them and make the developer hire a different not-for-profit. So they really do the marketing for our units in concert with our agency. And our agency makes sure that we see the leases, that we see the rents listed in the leases, that we income qualify, that we check the income qualifications that the not-for-profits do, and we make sure that these units are registered with our rent stabilization program. And that is just making sure initially the right people are in these properties at the right rents. And on an ongoing basis, these not-for-profits are responsible for rentals and re-rentals. And so, that's our way of making sure that there are eyes in the building, that the properties are going to the units are going to the right people, not somebody's cousin or relative, or God forbid, an over-income person. we also, in order to make sure that there's continued enforcement and that there's a place for people to go, we created a compliance and enforcement unit so that any tenant who has any issues, rent or otherwise, with one of our inclusionary units or other tax incentives units can go to call that compliance and enforcement unit. There are attorneys and project managers that will inspect, that will inform the tenants of what rents that they should be charged, and will work to help prosecute or take away benefits or help the landlord who wants to comply get into compliance. And I can't stress enough that compliance and enforcement is the key, because you don't want to create the units and lose them over time. You want to increase by increments the amount of affordable units that you have online in the city. So far, the City Council since 2016 has approved over 6,000 units of mandatory inclusionary housing, and about 2,000 so far has been financed, and we expect the program to continue. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to just move a few chairs and table and get some water up here. If anybody had a question on a card, now's a good time to make a note, and there'll be folks in either aisle to collect them. I've got a few that I'm going to start off with based on the conversations we had getting ready for today. I'm going to start off nice and easy and take it from there. I'm sure we'll have some challenging questions, but thank you very much both for fantastic presentations. And I know that in preparing for today, we thought we would start in the broadest of strokes. So how has this inclusionary zoning move, the incremental grow it over time, you having a lot and New York having a lot longer experience, has it made a positive difference to your city in terms of affordability and inclusiveness? And maybe describe how.
10,000 units since 2009 that you don't have to pay for is not bad. And so, inclusionary housing, inclusionary zoning really works where there's a private market that's building market rate housing. And so, but those are the markets where low-income people are priced out. Those are the markets that are close to transit, where there are the good schools, and it's where people work. And so to the extent you can get a private market to actually build housing that low-income people, even moderate income people, can afford to live in near good schools, where they work, near the hospitals, for us, that is a win, right? You're getting a thriving city of different kinds of people. You have the bankers, you have the lawyers, you have the CEOs, but you also have the artists, and you have the social worker, and you have the nanny, and that really is what gives a city energy, right? And to the extent you have industry that needs workers, you need these workers to be able to get to their jobs. So I find that, if the market is really producing units this way, we would be out of jobs, right? We wouldn't have to subsidize as a city low-income affordable housing. So we think it's an amazing, incredible tool, but it works where there's a market.
Thank you.
I'd like to I'd say ditto to much of that. I'll say a couple of specific things, though. We have basically a brand new neighborhood called the Seaport District, and we have a lot of complaints about how undiverse that neighborhood is. But 10% of the housing in that neighborhood is income restricted only because of this program. There was no private land in this neighborhood, no public land in this neighborhood for us to build any traditional affordable housing. So it's the only way we have any diversity in this neighborhood. Secondly, I want to speak to kind of the financial impacts of it. The U.S. federal government has been withdrawing from affordable housing for years in different ways. And so this has been a very important part for us, well before Trump. And so it's been a very important part of us beginning to pick up the pieces ourselves and provide the housing that we need and provide in a way that is for us and that we determine that destiny. And I think that's really important. It's through this. We also have what's called linkage fees, which are on commercial developments that also support affordable housing. So we have a number of programs. We have what's called the Community Preservation Act, which is a new tax levy that we're getting with state matching dollars. All of these things provide a way to fund affordable housing. Now, this tax levy, we're going to get about $20 million a year from that tax levy for affordable housing. That sounds like a lot of money. But you're right. We have to spread it around a lot of different projects and combine it with a lot of different other funding sources. But the developers, what they're spending, what they're losing in opportunity costs, and what they're spending on affordable housing through this policy is a lot bigger numbers that the public doesn't see because they're just providing the units. But some of that is tremendous amounts of funding.
We're going to pick up a little bit on, in a minute, I think, about some of the incentives that are provided not only at the city level, but potentially state and federal level. But before we get there, I know we ended on, Louise, you made the point about enforcement and compliance. We wanted to ask you three things. Toronto's just creating this framework. What are the three, if you had to say, okay, I know I talked for 20 minutes, but these are the three things you need to get right. Maybe I'll start with Tim and then turn it over to Louise. The three things you need to get right.
Well, one, I would say, do listen to your feasibility consultant. They toil away.
Maybe in the room.
Yeah, they do a lot of work to figure out what is actually achievable, and then they go to a city council, and the city council says, no, we want to do 20%, even though you said 15%. So it's really important because getting that right, I mean, you may leave a little bit on the table, but it's better to leave a little bit on the table than to have no production market rate housing at all. I think that's very important. Okay. The second one, I think, is the compliance issue. It's the stewardship of those units. I think it's really important you get that right. It's a challenge for us. We have to find a new way to do it. We have to look at what other cities are doing. But once you have a way of doing business in place, it's hard to change. So it's really important to get it done the first time. And the third thing is something I didn't really talk about that much, which is communication. It's really important to communicate what this program is to the public so that they don't decide, which we've sometimes had problems with, that it is, because we have a citywide program. It's not just about a density bonus. That people are now saying, I want all buildings to be affordable to me, instead of realizing that it is a part of a solution. So it's important to communicate both what the program is, that it is a trade-off for some density, that it is a community benefit, and that also to make sure that it's really clear. Developers also want to hear a pat on the back too, that they're doing something, and so it's important to highlight what they're doing.
That civic literacy component, I mean, being in the business of talking about sort of that interaction between private and public in many of the projects we work on is so critical. Being as transparent as you can about whose job is it to do what becomes really critical. Okay, Louise, three things that from your experience, the advice that you would give us, the three things that Toronto absolutely needs to get right.
I would say feasibility, predictability, and enforcement. So, we have a voluntary inclusionary program and a mandatory inclusionary program, but in fact, all inclusionary housing is voluntary. Because if it's not financially feasible, real estate is an investment, and people are going to look at where they can put their money, and to the extent you leave nothing on the table for people to reap from their investment, money is going to go somewhere else. So when you size the affordability ask, you have to understand what it does in an actual building and how somebody's going to produce that building and still manage to realize some gain from being in the real estate business. So I would say feasibility is the first one. If they can't afford to do it, they're not going to do it. Predictability. People need to, again, if you have a business, you want to know what environment you're playing in. And so you need to be clear what the requirements are, and that when you change them, you're changing them through a process that people can absorb the changes. And the last one is accountability, right? And so to the extent that it is a community land trust, in a way, you want to watch and protect your investment, and your investment is the density that you've given a developer so that they can build a bigger building, get more rents, make a profit. That's your investment. That's your equity in that deal, and you want to make sure that you're protecting that equity long term.
Okay, I'm going to jump in with one more, and then I think we got a few from the audience that I want to work through. But I know that the incentives question is one that's come up through the consultation process, and certainly the City of Toronto is trying to figure that out. It's always difficult because you live in a different regulatory and governance framework than we do here. That being said, I think a lot of what you said resonated, especially from comments I heard from the chairs. Yeah, that's our story too. So maybe talk to us a little bit about the incentives that and how the role of incentives at whatever level of government played. And do you want to start us off?
So our premise is, first, if you size your program to the current market, whatever your current market conditions are, if you do it right in a strong market, you shouldn't have to pay for it. And so if you start from that basis and then you look at your other markets, your weak markets and your emerging markets, that's where you may need to subsidize, you may need to give a boost in order to get that market to move, so that housing can later be produced where you don't have to pay for it. So the New York City landscape has been for a long time that rental housing, at least, cannot be produced without a real property tax exemption. So that was our base and that was our status quo. If we look at, in strong markets, what production is and what drives production, now how much of that production can we reserve for the community, for low-income households, and how much density do we need to give in order to maintain the status quo of a return, or maybe in some cases even a higher return. So, you know, if people are going to argue that it's going to hit their bottom line, and you say, well, your bottom line is not going to change, right? It's not going to change because I know what your baseline is, and I'm giving you some density, and I'm taking this, you should be able to pay for it. You should have an ordinance where in certain markets you're not paying.
We do have a program called 121A, which is a tax incentive that you can give to buildings. It's been highly criticized over the years, and at this point, we rarely use it, except for to make it more financially feasible for publicly subsidized buildings. So it's used very rarely. And we also have, in some ways, thankfully, a fairly conservative tax office. We have a very high credit rating, you know, all those great things that cities want to have in terms of their debt. But it means that we also have a lot less flexibility. We do not grant any kind of tax incentives to developments to do their inclusionary development. We also don't grant them any basically give back on infrastructure costs. These larger projects that need infrastructure, they do it themselves. We expect that. The city's not even doing it. We're expecting them to do the infrastructure. We do have a couple of situations that are a little bit unique, though. One is that we are waking up to the fact that we are not producing middle-income housing, market rate middle-income housing. And so we're going to start investigating ways that maybe we do provide some kind of incentives for those buildings that are producing. It is the building for the teacher that also has inclusionary units instead of for the banker, because we're just not creating them. Also, we have the former Suffolk Downs, which is our old horse track racing site. It's 160 acres. It's the size of an entire Boston neighborhood. and it's owned by one developer. And we have a lot of pressure to do more affordable housing in that project than we do in our normal policy. The thing is, it's in an outer neighborhood. He can't actually, the rents are not there to support that. So we're striking this deal right now that says, if you get infrastructure money from the state, you'll pay that into a fund for affordable housing. So in other words, it's basically in the long run, they still pay the infrastructure costs, but what we get is more affordable housing.
Yeah, Adam.
I do want to clarify. So I just want to we incentivize rental housing in New York City through real property tax exemptions. So that is our baseline. We're already giving incentives. And the upzoning is also an incentive, right? So if you can build 10 units and now I allow you to build 30 or 40 and I only take a portion of that, that is an incentive. And so we think where markets are weak, where people need housing, then the city should do more. And we give loans, other tax exemptions, et cetera, in very low-income communities to spur housing.
So I've got a whole bunch of questions, and I didn't get through all the ones the city wanted to, but there's some that are similar, and some are directed specifically to one or the other of you. So maybe I'm going to start with Louise, and then I'm going to kind of bounce around. So there's a question here around the nonprofit role, and I think it's maybe something, and you guys, Tim, decide where you want to jump in. Are nonprofits also involved in providing support services, not just the income sort of tracking and sort of the rental, the rental, the clearer you write, the easier it is for me to read this. But not just the other types of rental supports that that you were talking about. Is there a role in providing support services?
No, not for our inclusionary housing. So our not-for-profits provide support services for our supportive housing projects. And so to the extent a mandatory inclusionary housing project does have a supportive housing component, then yes. But the baseline of services that are required is the renting and re-rental. To the extent that we have placed homeless tenants with vouchers in those properties, with rental subsidies, I should say, in those properties, depending on how many homeless tenants that we're actually putting in a building, we may be looking to a not-for-profit to provide some support services. So, but the baseline service that we're asking for is rental and re-rental, and depending on the population. So under mandatory inclusionary housing, you can do senior housing. And to the extent you're doing senior housing, we might be looking at what kind of programming are you doing for seniors, what type of seniors are you putting in this housing, what kinds of needs do they have. And so depending on what's proposed to us, we may ask for more, but typically that's the baseline.
Yeah, good. Okay, so I think maybe this one relates to both of you, and it has to do with displacement. And it's framed in a couple of different ways. One was, are there concerns that upzoning in low and moderate income neighborhoods could lead to further displacement, or upzoning in some neighborhoods could create gentrification, displacement pressures? Are there any steps you were taking to ensure that no displacement takes place? So maybe have you seen these your inclusionary zoning efforts or inclusionary housing efforts lead to any kind of displacement pressures? And if so, have you taken any steps, or are there steps that you can take to avoid this happening? Have you had this experience?
So I wouldn't say it's necessarily an inclusionary zoning, because I said ours is really a policy, not in the zoning, but we are working through, some upzonings in some areas. Most of the upzoning we've done to date has been in areas that were pretty segregated industrial areas that became residential, rather than, or they may be adjacent to a neighborhood. But we do have two strategic planning areas that we've been working through where this is a concern. One of them was that there was a lot of development pressure in a neighborhood, and the neighborhood asked us to come out and do a planning process. And so in the end, the result was that the inclusionary development policy is in some ways used to actually reduce the development pressure on the neighborhood. We were approving buildings of 6 stories and FAR, if you know that means of 3. And what we are doing now is that the new buildings have to be like 4 stories or 5 stories and certain setbacks, and they meet other requirements. And instead of 13% income restricted, we're expecting about 22% income restricted. And so the only projects coming in tend to be a little bit more smaller scale. There's fewer of them. It has reduced the pressure on the neighborhood itself. And that also is being done hand in hand with some other larger policy efforts, including the Acquisition Opportunity Program, which is where we're funding the acquisition of existing rental housing in neighborhoods such as this to keep it affordable and to make it long-term affordable. We have an Office of Housing Stability, which is a citywide office that works with tenants to make sure that they're getting legal representation in eviction cases and addressing other kinds of housing stability issues. So there's some citywide issues that we're trying to tackle. People in the neighborhood say we're not doing enough though. And it's really hard. We have the second one I'm going to mention is in the planning process right now. And again, it's another, mostly, we're really focusing on an industrial area, but there is a low-income neighborhood adjacent to it. And so it's really hard for us to know, and it's really hard for us to measure what exactly is going to be the displacement, if any, amongst a city that is already a neighborhood that's close to a transit station. It already has pressures that aren't even related to what we're doing. So, and there's this balance between we need to create more housing to let off the steam from the market as a whole, and yet how do we help the people who are already living there?
Great. What's your experience in New York?
So, that was the outcry when we tried to pass our mandatory inclusionary housing ordinance, the fear of displacement. And what we've told communities is that, if your when the market changes in your neighborhood, you can be, because change does come and will come, you'll be left behind. Because then the market rate developer will not have any incentive to provide housing for a range of incomes for low-income households. Or we can lock in permanent affordability today, and so that when the market does change and people are producing housing, that there'll always be that level of housing that's permanently affordable, long-term, no matter what. So, we've seen areas in the city where abandoned buildings, nobody would go, artists live there, drugs, and now people sold their properties, they moved out of state, and now the properties cost millions of dollars, right? So when communities change, do you want to have no permanent affordable housing stock that can serve the community? A second way we combat it is that we say 50% of the units produced have to be marketed to residents who live in the community. So we have the 50% community board preference, whereby any inclusionary housing units that are produced in that community, 50% first offered to residents and then to others from other boroughs or other community districts. The third thing we do is we have an active code enforcement, rental enforcement, and many other enforcement programs. So, we are funding not-for-profits that do testing, that go out and see if landlords, what types of people's landlords are turning away versus others. We have code enforcement. So, to the extent tenants are being harassed based on lack of heat, lack of hot water, lack of services, we have inspectors that go out and investigate those claims, and we either fine the landlord or the owner, We require them to make the repairs, and if they don't, we do it, and we put a lien against their properties. We have funded legal services for low-income tenants who are facing eviction, that they could get lawyers from legal aid and other areas to defend them on the city's dime. So we have a lot of other programs to get at ways that landlords harass tenants or get tenants out of their neighborhoods. But what we say to people is that, you know, while we're doing all of that, and while we have a housing plan to build or preserve 300,000 units, you have got to make the market produce housing for everybody. And so that's what we think we're doing.
I don't know if this takes it in a similar, and then we're going to let it go and change the subject a little bit. Another participant here framed it in terms of, do you find, it's almost the question they're getting at, is there a sort of a net benefit to the number of affordable units, or is it possible to even measure? So for example, this person framed it, it's just a continuation. Do you find the market housing unit prices are being driven up in projects with inclusionary zoning? Is this creating issues for those who fall just outside of the qualifying bracket, who otherwise were just able to afford market rental costs? So it's connected to this issue of displacement. Do you see that all of our cities, I think, have a desperate need for this additional affordability? Does this kind of program, do you have enough experience or the data yet to sort of conclude what that does to the sort of the market at a larger scale? It might just be a quick affirmation.
It only works where, it works well where there's a strong housing market, where market rate rents are really fueling development. And so which comes first, right? So we have rezoned areas under the voluntary program where nothing happened for 10 years. And then suddenly the market got there, right? And now luxury housing is being produced. And now we're getting permanently affordable housing units as part of that, right? But you know, when you first rezone an area that isn't hot, that is a weak market, sometimes nothing happens for a while. So it's really the market rents that have come, when the market pushes out to you, you know, that is going to happen no matter what.
And some would say that I think there is more data needed in some ways to look at this really well, but the general theory behind all inclusionary development in strong markets is that the rents are what the rents are. And what the inclusionary development does is it pushes down the land price that the landowner can sell to the developer. So that may, in fact, increase affordability for some properties nearby, meaning the single or the two-family house. They can't sell it to some developer for $1 jillion to be torn down. It might actually help to preserve some of those smaller properties as the value that they are to a family.
Okay, so this one switches gears a little bit. It talks about engagement. Can you talk more about how you engage communities? You both talked about, in some cases, being in the middle of or having done lots of community engagement. And this one specifically, how you engaged communities that felt strongly that their communities already had too much affordable housing. I think we touched on it a little bit. Let's just dive a little deeper. And what kind of narrative do you construct to sort of help talk about the state's position? I mean, one of the things we always say is governments have the burden of trying to find common ground among different points of view. Governments allocate resources according to values, public resources according to public values. You are in a position that other stakeholders are not, and you have that burden. So how do you approach and talk about this and with communities, particularly where they're not interested in more affordability for whatever reason?
Right. So I'm thinking specifically of one neighborhood in our city that has it's traditionally had a high level of poverty, a high level of income-restricted housing, and there have been people in the neighborhood, both renters and especially the homeowners, who, for 20 years, the whole time I've been in housing, who said, we don't want any more. We want more market rate housing. We want more market rate housing. And as part of this area, there is what was, once upon a time, Boston's second most important kind of commercial district that has fallen on very bad times and has really struggled to come back. And but the thing is, we also own a lot of public land there. It's one of the few places where we own a bunch of land. You know, like she was saying, hey, Toronto, you've got this great land. We don't have a lot, but this particular neighborhood we do. And so we have undergone a planning process with the neighborhood that's gone on over 2 years to talk about what we want here. But the tension has been that you really have, it's almost like you have the elders of the neighborhood who said, we've been asking for 25 years for market rate housing, and you've got younger people from the neighborhood who are saying, but our city's rents are exploding. I don't have any place to go. So we've really had a chore to figure out what to do with these parcels. And we've kind of reverted to a model that was done in another neighborhood about 20 years ago of a third, a third, a third. So all these parcels will have a third low income, a third moderate income, and a third market rate. But there is also still a really strong interest in wealth building and home ownership. So we've also privileged these as home ownership projects. And a lot of these are on like commercial streets. So we're also like, okay, we need some first floor retail, commercial uses, community uses, cultural uses, and upstairs, housing. So it's still to see how that all works out. And it's going to require public subsidies to make these buildings work. These are not being supported by the market. They also require public subsidies. But we're at least trying to create some income diversity in an area where 75% of the housing is income restricted.
Okay.
So, I mean, if you're going to create a citywide ordinance, you're going to get a lot of different things coming at you. You're going to get the people who'll say that it's not affordable enough, right? That we got the affordable to whom. And then you're going to get the people who say we have enough, we don't want any more. But you have to create a citywide ordinance. And so what we did was try to create options with the toggles, right? If you, for a higher AMI option, you're going to give us more affordable housing. For a lower AMI option, we're going to ask for less affordable housing. And ideally, and we didn't get this perfectly because of our politics, you would have a couple of options that are mapped where there are choices. But people must remember, none of this housing is 100% affordable. So it's really housing for a range of incomes. It's really balanced housing. Even for a 30% option, you have 70% market rate. And so it's disingenuous if you're not asking for 100% affordable housing for someone to say we have enough. But because what you're really doing is increasing both affordable and market rate housing in an area.
And do you talk is a big part of your narrative? For example, you talked about, and you started with the vibrancy of the city and all of the different incomes and roles. And is that a part of the narrative that you are using in New York?
Absolutely.
In Boston as well, like the fundament, like the public policy rationale kind of step. I'm about to ask you a couple questions about the nitty gritty of the pro formas, but in the bigger picture, what's the narrative, like the persuasive narrative from the value this serves publicly? Like, do you talk about that?
Absolutely. Economic diversity really is what underpins our plan. If for a growing city, even if you are extremely wealthy, people need employees, right? And so companies need employees. The city needs very different kinds of people to be a thriving city. And so we have always said that in order for a city that doesn't grow, dies. Change is happening one way or another. And so what kind of city do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a thriving city where there's economic diversity, there are different people? That's what makes New York City interesting. And so in order to preserve that buzz that we have in our city of all different kinds of people, of all walks of life, we have to have the housing where they live and work.
Okay, now you pivot, and then I'm coming to Tim after. So this is a big pivot. Cash in lieu, right into the detail. Ms. Carroll, regarding payment in lieu, how do you decide that for each project? How do you determine cash in lieu?
So we determined on a square footage basis. Also, so what we did, we looked at, because the fee in lieu only applies to smaller developments, we looked at the tax basis for the valuation for these properties. We looked at the cost of production per square foot of affordability that we as a city, so we produce term sheets that tells the markets we're a gap filler to finance affordable housing projects. So we produce these term sheets that say per dwelling unit in this program, we will offer you X per dwelling unit in a loan. And so we decided that our in lieu fee could not be less than what we would give a developer as a gap filler to provide a loan. So that was our baseline, right? So if we, to finance a low-income unit, if we were going to pay $125,000 per dwelling unit, what is that? And if our units are about 750 square feet, we could not have an in lieu fee that was less than that. And so that was our starting point. And then we looked at all of the properties of those sizes and what the revenue is for those properties when we look at our tax DOF numbers, and what it would cost if we were to put per DU for that 25% or that 30%. And that's how we toggle the fee, and the fee is too high. But it is the way we set the fee, and we have a rulemaking that explains the formula for our fee on our website, on our HPD website. But that was the thinking behind it.
I think in your presentation you said it didn't go the way you wanted. That's what you've got. You wanted to weigh in.
Our fee is set in some respects what it costs for rental units, what it costs the developer to have the unit on site. So it's not our cost of creating the unit. It's actually in the outer neighborhoods, it's lower. But my recommendation for our update is that we go to, if we're going to if we have to replace the unit somewhere, it should be the same fee. So we're kind of moving to that same system. But we really, when we revised the policy in 2015, we actually kind of set it so that we were telling developers we didn't want you to cash out. So our friends at the Department of Neighborhood Development, who spends the money, is beginning to get a little crotchety because they're getting less money from me. Because the developers now are the high-end condos, instead of cashing out, are now putting their units off-site. And every other project is doing everything on-site, except for they may get what we call a partial unit fee, which may change as well if we go to a square footage system. One of the reasons why the change around 2015 happened as well is because in the previous administration, there's a different formula for condominiums. What we do is the fee for the rentals is our minimum, but what we do is we say, you're going to sell your unit for $1 million. We would have sold it for $200,000. That difference is $800,000. We'll take half of that. We take $400,000. So that's why the thing is, the thing is now we have units selling for $2 million. So imagine that difference. So what was happening in the previous, so this condo formula was created in 2006. It was never really fully implemented. What the previous administration did is they used it as a bargaining chip. They would say, well, you would have had to pay $10 million. We're going to let you get away with $8 million. How do you think that looks for transparency and for predictability? It's awful. So even before, when Mayor Walsh took office in 2014, even before the 2015 changes in the policy, we started applying that formula strictly. And that's when the developer said, oops, I'll do offsite units. But we still are going to probably maintain some kind of formula like that. And some of the numbers that we could get are astounding, but they're doing offsite units instead.
Okay, I'm looking a little bit at my watch and getting close to wrapping up, and I assume there aren't any other questions coming our way, so I'm going to stick with what we've got here. It was another quick pro forma question. Start over here again. Is a pro forma required from developers, and how or what authority is used to do this, and how is the pro forma used, and maybe something that applies to both?
So no, we do not require pro forma, and the reason we don't is in order to create the program, we created the pro forma. So we worked with our financial analysts to build a massive model, and the model toggled everything. So we looked at all of our voluntary program over time and all of the underwriting that we'd ever received. We looked at costs under RS means for production. We looked at rents in the city. We figured out how much it would cost to build a 7-story building, a 13-story building if you put in an elevator. If you went higher from block and plank to steel, what that would mean. We figured out what the rent would be on the 3rd floor versus the 10th floor versus the 20th floor. So we built the pro forma. And we put in a cash-on-cash return, and we put in a first year IRR, and basically we judged that at a 6% return in the first year, you could invest in a project. And so from a weak market to a strong market to a very strong market, using one tax exemption versus tax credits, we built the pro forma so that by the time, and we talked to not-for-profit developers, we talked to for-profit developers, we talked to advocates. By the time we went out with our plan, we knew what you could build and where you can build it. And we know that pro forma holds even as costs increase. So we don't need their pro forma. What we are scared of are the people who build these small units that don't pay the in lieu fee because we.
So we, very similar in many ways, with one exception. The cash in lieu and the offsite option is not what we call an as-of-right option. Not in a zoning term, but in a programmatic term. And so, except for high-end condos downtown, they have those options if they're doing the offsite units within 1/2 mile. Otherwise, we require the pro forma because we see that as a form of relief from the standard practice of the program. Also, we've been asking for the pro formas if they want an offsite unit, period. Although even if it's an as-of-right option. So we asked for it. They agree to give it to us. If they want their project approved, they are willing to share it with us.
So if it's 100% affordable,
oh yeah,
we want to see it. Sorry. If it's 100% affordable, we want to see the pro forma because we really want to make sure that those units are financially feasible in perpetuity without the city having to subsidize it. So we do ask if it's 100% affordable. Otherwise, if a lender is going to lend to build a 70-30 project or a 75-25 project, then it's the lender's risk. And that's mostly a market rate project, so we don't need the pro forma.
we'll just share it.
Good, perfect. Last one, I think, and then we're going to wrap up for 8:30. There were a few questions, and I'm not going to go into them all, but that we're really digging into. One of the lovely things about having you guys here, and you're obviously in such high command of the subject matter, is that people would love to interrogate you longer. And on subjects such as, what do you think of our 25-year? You both have perpetuity. Don't weigh in on that one. Then also, what do you think about, what do you think about, you've got lower the threshold number of units, for example, in it where it would be applied. So there are a whole stack of things, and I'm sorry for those folks that didn't get it, but I just want to, for the last one, how have development industry attitudes and opposition evolved over time with your program? And then we'll wrap it up. So what's your experience seeing it evolve over time? We haven't even started.
Right. I mentioned a little bit in my remarks about the developers that it's not our business and now it's everybody's business. That really is part of it. There's still pushback, but I think they are more of don't push too far. As I said, we're updating not only the inclusionary development policy, we're also updating our linkage policy. That is affordable housing funds generated from commercial developments. And so, we're hearing from developers where they think they have more room to give than others, and we're looking at that balance. But we want to push them where we can, period. And the advocates and the council is very interested in pushing beyond that in many ways. So it's a fine balance, and they have not been as organized as I've expected. They've been a lot quieter about this, but maybe they know that at this particular political moment, no one is their fan. Everyone screaming, too much luxury housing, too much luxury housing. In some ways, they're defeating themselves by not producing some of the housing we need, even though the money may not be in it. I understand that. And we'll see if there's any pushback at our State House in terms of making this into zoning, if that's where we will see kind of the quiet work on the suburban legislators who actually play a role in whether we get this zoning or not ourselves.
Interesting. We'll watch. And for New York, how has it changed over time?
When we did this process, we engaged all of our developers. We went through all of the discussions of the financial models. So we all pretty much agreed by the end where this thing works, right? And where it doesn't work because it's an emerging market or because it's a weak market, the city pledged to help finance those units in order to spur the market. So, the developers were okay and they testified on our behalf, not for profit and for profit. Fast forward till today where, every time there's a private rezoning, the legislature adds additional asks and requirements. They ignore the financial analysis and they have an overreach. And so at this point, no one's happy because in areas where we would expect to get it for free, if you put in that many requirements, then people are coming to the city for subsidy, which is something we do not want to do. So I think you have a different structure. Hopefully, when you create your zoning program, it will be predictable and it will be feasible without your legislature constantly taking their pound of flesh.
Brings that certainty that you're talking about that's really required. Okay, so I ask you all to join me in thanking these two great folks. And I think we'll hand it over to our chief planner, Gregg Lintern. He wants to give some closing
just
remarks.
very quickly, I wanted to just extend thank you to the YWCA for hosting us tonight and their staff. Big hand of applause for this. Also, just to extend our gratitude to Tim and Louise for taking time out of their very, very busy schedules and coming up to the Great White North to see us and spend some time. I'm hearing that it's maybe going to snow tonight, so you get to experience some of our winter, but you get your own fun in Boston and New York. But it's been great, and it really is a very, very complicated topic, and I think you really were able to help us navigate through it tonight and really get some light into the corners of what is going on in your cities, and we really appreciate that insight, and also to Nicole for helping us moderate, and to the audience and all your questions. It's great. I think we've got a great pile of them now that we'll definitely be pursuing as we continue the consultation. I've got a little gift, perhaps, somewhere. There they are, for Tim and Louise. Now, we don't have oceans in Toronto. We have Lake Ontario. But this is Louise. But what we do have in Toronto are ravines. And they're a great natural resource. So in that bag is a book about something that we really cherish deeply in Toronto. And it's something for you to take back to your cities with you. And when you come back to visit us the next time, you can go for a great walk. You'll know the place cold from that book. I'll give you a quiz. Anyway, thanks again, everybody.